Every week there's something where I think about what our social contract is, and what about this commitment that we must make if we're going to figure out how to live together in this world. And it feels like that makes me believe that being a part of a covenantal faith is now more important than ever. For many years since Unitarians and Universalists moved away from officially calling themselves Christians, we have described our faith as a covenantal faith, not a creedal faith. For me, what that means is that we come together in sacred promise in our individual and collective search for truth and meaning. Also, we are not beholden to any creeds in order to join a congregation or call ourselves Unitarian Universalist. And although we don't have any creedal beliefs, I certainly hope that those who say they are practicing this faith have at some point heard about, read, or studied our principles and values and feel that there is something to which they can subscribe. In fact, the preamble of the 7 principles, when they were written, begins with, "We covenant together to affirm and promote." So then what does it actually mean that we are a covenantal faith, and why is that so important? In the book entitled Redeeming Time, specifically about church covenants, it defines as a covenant as the common understanding, agreements, and promises made by members of a congregation that define their mutual obligations and commitments to each other as they try to live out their faith and their vision. Reverend Barbara Threet writes, "Covenants are not creedal statements, but statements of intention and commitment regarding how we live together and what we will do to the best of our ability to maintain and sustain our community." Our church polity, which is our organizational and governance structure, is based in covenant rather than doctrine. The earliest church covenants in New England in the Puritan churches, which are our forebearers, were actually fairly simple. The polity was congregational, like ours is now, and each was self-governing. The Salem Covenant of 1629 reads simply, "We covenant with the Lord and with one another, and do bind ourselves to the presence of God to walk together in his ways, according as he is pleased to reveal himself unto us in his blessed word of truth." Reverend Threet continues, "Covenant is woven deeply into our UU faith." What she's talking about is a long tradition of making and keeping sacred promises. And so I ask, what is a sacred promise? Well, one definition that I like for sacred is something that is set apart, holy, and deserving of spiritual respect, devotion, awe, or reverence, often associated with the divine or religious purpose. The spiritual respect, devotion, awe, or reverence, often associated with the divine or religious purpose. And in a world where truth, spiritual respect, honesty, and commitment to living in relationship with each other is suffering greatly, I would say that this Unitarian Universalist practice is indeed incredibly important. And it's an important religious practice, and one we should take seriously as a practice of this tradition, because above all else, our sacred covenant of this covenantal faith is about how we mutually agree to live with each other in complex relationships. It's very apparent right now that we as a country are in the midst of many complex relationships. So let's explore a little further what covenant means and why it's such an important practice. It is essentially the sacred promises based in our core desires of how we would like the world to be. And as always, the delicate balance between the I and the we. That's why such an important part of our covenant together as Unitarian Universalists is to be clear about our agreements and our expectations when it comes to being with each other in these complex relationships. We base our religious practice on choosing to be together, not pledging a shared creed as we work in the world to live and build beloved community. As Reverend Victoria Safford says, a covenant is not a contract. It is not made and signed and sealed once and for all, sent to attorneys for safekeeping, or guarded under glass in a museum. A covenant is not a static artifact, and it's not a sworn oath, whereas. Therefore I will do this, or I'll die, so help me God. A covenant is a living, breathing aspiration made every day, and it can't be enforced by consequences, but it may be reinforced by forgiveness and grace, and when we stumble, and when we forget, and when we mess up. Unitarian Universalist theologian James Luther Adams lists 5 major ingredients of covenant. First, human beings, individually and collectively, become human by making commitments and by making promises. The human being, such as Martin Buber says, is the promise-making, promise-keeping, promise-breaking, and promise-renewing creature. 2, the covenant is a covenant of being. It is a covenant with the creative, sustaining, commanding, judging, transforming powers, which may be interpreted theistically or non-theistically, humanistically, but in a religious covenant, the orientation is to something we cannot control, but is something upon which we depend, even for our freedom. 3, the covenant is for the individual as well as the collective. The individual is brought out of separateness into covenant. And we are responsible for individual behavior, but also for the character of our society. 4, the covenant responsibility is especially directed towards the deprived. I knew I was going to get that wrong. Whether these people suffering from neglect and injustice, or those who are caught in the system that suppresses them, that suppresses their own self-determination, it is the gap between covenant and system, between ideal and behavior, that creates deprivation. And finally, 5, the covenant includes the rule of law. But it is not fundamentally a legal covenant. It depends on faithfulness, and faithfulness is nerved by loyalty and love. Violation of the covenant is a violation of trust. What holds the world together, according to this dual covenant then, is trustworthiness and neighborly love. Ultimately, the ground of faithfulness is the divine or human love that will not let us go. Does any of this sound important in today's world? This is, in so many ways, describing that social contract that we have with each other in this congregation and in this country. A social contract that can be damaged or irrevocably harmed when the violations of covenant and of trust are broken, like they seem to be every single day with this administration, that apparently would like to prosecute me and others for saying that anything that calls out the daily breaks of the social contract with this administration. That's why this religious practice of covenant, along with the secular concept of social contract, it isn't an academic concept. It is a vital, current, and living practice for every minute of every day. As stated from the passage of the book Redeeming Time, we are talking about the common understanding, agreements, and promises made by members of a congregation, or I will add to that, of a society, that define their mutual obligations and commitments to each other as they try to live their faith and vision. So again, this is no small thing for us as a congregation to model and to practice in the world where at times it feels like there are no sacred promises. It makes me wonder, what are our sacred promises? Is it a sacred promise to bring a dish to a potluck? Or make coffee on a Sunday morning? How does a sacred promise go? How deep does a sacred promise go? Is it a sacred promise to respect the spiritual journeys of others in the congregation, whether it is yours or not? Is it a sacred promise to stay together in community, working through issues in healthy ways, even when it's hard or there's conflict? Is it a sacred promise to intentionally try living your life in accordance with the values and lessons that you have learned as a part of this community, and to consciously practice that way of living every single day? Of course, my answer to all of these questions is yes. And I certainly hope so, and so much more. Because as we practice this with each other, we are building something important and meaningful here. UUCF has been a special place throughout its 70 years of history. And we still are. Ever increasingly, actually, ready to help all of us meet the moment of this time. So in these days through which we are now traveling, I am truly hoping that the energy that we bring to building and practicing this covenant of love and trust and faithfulness is something that lives in each and every one of us every day. And that is something that rises above what is happening in this world as an example of how to model and build the world for which we dream. And even with the differences that come with being human, and there are so many, I still hold out hope, even more hope, that we can truly commit to finding the sacred in our shared covenant and each other. May that be so.